And I think had it been really easy, I might have skipped the idea of adopting because it's a lot easier in a lot of ways to have a biological child than to adopt.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Reesa and I'm your host. We are talking to real families about real stories here on The Real Family Eats, where we've got food for thought and thoughtful food. So let's eat. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us again. I'm excited for today's episode, and I'm excited for you to try out this recipe too. I have the wonderful Dana here joining us. Hi, Dana. Thanks so much for being a guest on The Real Family Eats.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know you, can you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dana Parisi, and I always start by telling people that I'm a mom of four kids. And I know it's not all that I am, but it's pretty much the most important job that I do. So I'm a mom of four. I have two biological kids and then two kids who joined our family through adoption. And then because of that shift in our family, I changed focus from being a physical therapist, which is a career I loved, and really because of my own journey and learning that I had to do went to doing parent coaching. So I support parents that are parenting kids that have some persistent challenging behaviors. My real passion is to help families of kids who've experienced some trauma, whether that's through adoption or foster care journeys or early life experiences. But a lot of the families I work with also have kids who have neurodiversities like autism or ADHD or are dealing with mental health struggles. So that's what I do as my business. I absolutely love what I do. But it's also really important to me that my business is just part of my life because my mom job is the top of my priority.
Yes, and I imagine there's a lot of listeners out there that can absolutely relate. And it's a full-time job in itself, right? And so
It totally
essentially
is.
we're working multiple jobs when you've got the parenting hat on as well. Okay, so tell us a little bit before we get into more of your story. What recipe are you sharing with our parents today, and why did you choose this one?
Yes. Okay. So we are doing tuna noodle casserole, which my family calls tuna noodle stinkle, which is an affectionate name. I know it's kind of funny. If you've ever read the Junie B. Jones books, there's a book in there and she talks about a casserole and she calls it tuna stinkle. And we've taken it from that. So even though everyone loves it, that's the name that we call it. And so this is, if you have multiple kids in your home, finding a recipe that pretty much everyone likes is like one of
Mhm.
those gold gems. And this is a recipe
Yes.
that's a family favorite. All four of my kids and my husband and I enjoy it. And it's pretty easy to make. Like by the time work is done, I can wrap it up and have it ready in time before sports activities start.
Fantastic. And you're so right. And that's part of, the goal behind combining this podcast with an informal pretend cooking show because like you said, trying to kind of find what are we going to have for dinner? That's just one more thing on a plate, a very full plate that many parents have. And so you're so spot on in that it's really helpful when you've got a couple of things in your back pocket that your family is going to love and that's going to kind of nourish everybody and get you moving.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And it's got hidden vegetables. Well, not even hidden. They're vegetables in there and it's got a little something, everything, a little bit of everything.
Perfect. Okay, so speaking of, can you tell me kind of an overview of what I'm putting in here, the steps, and I can get mixing and cooking while we chat?
Perfect. That sounds great. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is get some noodles boiling. So boiling some water. The recipe I think says corkscrew, but my kids have decided they like shells, like those little pasta shells is their favorite
Okay.
format. We've also used like the little elbow macaronis as like pastas for it. So any little pasta shape that you like, you're going to want to start boiling that. And then we're going to be draining a can of tuna. And I like to
Okay.
rinse it really good so that it doesn't smell too much like tuna. So drain it really well. And then I usually defrost some frozen broccoli, like broccoli flowers, the bags of
Hmm.
broccoli flowers that are frozen. I defrost that in the microwave. So those
Okay.
are the things that I would get started. And then we just open up a couple cans of soup, cheesy broccoli soup, and then either cream of broccoli or cream of celery, whichever one you can find. And then there's some cheddar cheese in there and some onion, either dice it up or just use the dried minced onion, which is super
Hmm.
easy. And those are the main things in there, a little salt and pepper and some cheddar cheese.
Wonderful. And then we mix it all up and put it in that casserole and put it in the oven, correct?
Exactly. We're going to mix the noodles once they're cooked and drained with the tuna that's drained. And then the broccoli, we're going to chop it up a little bit finer so that, any of your kids who don't like a giant chunk of broccoli will hardly notice it. You can cut it up a little smaller, then mix it with those 2 cans of soup and the salt and pepper and the cheese. Yeah, and then it just goes right into a casserole dish and bake it. And I have found, Risa, that if we cover it with tin foil while it's baking, the top
Hmm.
noodles don't get too crunchy and hard, and they all
Okay.
stay kind of soft. So that's one way to do it. And then we put chips on top of it, which makes it, a family favorite.
Do you put the chips on before you bake it and you bake it with the chips on it?
Actually, we wait until it's all baked and we just put the chips on our individual servings. We've found
Okay.
this by trial and error because if you put all the chips on it, then when you microwave it later, leftovers, the chips get all soggy. So we just crunch up
Oh,
the chips on the individual serving. And some of my kids
oh,
like to add some hot sauce to it
okay.
at the end.
So many pro tips in there with your aluminum foil and your chips on individual portions so you don't have to microwave. So I love it. I can absolutely do that. In fact, I've got my tuna and my noodles already boiled. And okay, for anybody who is watching, don't come for me because I know that my noodles got a little overcooked when I boiled them this morning. That's the reality of parenting. I looked away for what felt like a hot second to take care of something, and then they went over. So I know that they are. Please don't judge me. Don't come for me in the comments. But I'm going to get mixing with what I have here. Okay, so while I'm doing all of this, I'd love to know a little bit about kind of your journey, Dana, especially with, like you said, you've got two biological children and then you've got two more through adoption. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that adoption process and what that's like, because I know there's a lot of listeners out there that can probably relate. And it's a very different journey than, what maybe your average beaver cleaver kind of would walk through. And so I'd love to know kind of your experience and what that was like for you and how you navigated.
Yeah, that's why it's a loaded question. Thank you for asking that. Um, my experience, our two adoptions were two separate adoptions, so 4 years apart. And I think one of the biggest challenges about adoption is that you don't know a time frame. Like with my biological kids, you assume it's going to be about 9 months of being pregnant. So
Mm-hmm.
you think, you've got that time frame in mind. My biological kids were actually each born 2 months early, which had its own trials to it. And that was a very scary time. But our adoption processes were very undetermined amount of time. And there were a lot of moments where really we had done all the steps that we could do for the adoption. There's all this paperwork and all these documents you have to have, you do your home study, and there's a lot of boxes to check. And when you get done with all those boxes, um,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like now it should just happen. And, you should be able to start parenting this child. And sometimes it happens fast, but in our situations, it was very slow. And just kind of trusting the process and waiting was really hard for us. And then,
Okay.
our family dynamics change, like with any child that comes into your family, whether it's a biological child or through adoption or foster care, dynamics are always going to change when that
Mm-hmm.
happens. And one of the fears that we had going into adoption was I remember my husband saying, like, I'm just worried that we're going to rock the boat because things had kind of settled out with our two children that we had in the home. Like they were starting school and, we kind of had some rhythm. And it just felt like, oh, do we really want to change the dynamics and add one more person to it? And of course, I'm glad that we did, but the boat got rocked. Our boat of our family life really got rocked through our
Wow.
processes.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more for you folks? How did you come to that decision? Like you said that, if there's already that kind of, hey, we're kind of finding our footing maybe a little bit, or at least finding what our normal looks like, right? And then, like you said, to kind of come to that decision and say, could I rock the boat? Maybe, but this is something that we really want. Can you talk to me a little bit more about kind of how you guys came to the decision?
Yeah, and I think every family comes to it through their own means. But
Mm-hmm.
for us, my husband and I both, prior to even meeting each other, kind of felt called to adopt. And I don't know if it's part of our faith tradition, just recognizing that God adopted us into his family and, wanting to love on others. So it was kind
Mm-hmm.
of in our mindset to consider it. And then I really think practicality wise, had our biological pregnancies not been so challenging, and then premature births and NICU, we were in the hospital with our preemies for several weeks with each kid. It was a really scary time. And I think
Yeah.
had it been really easy, I might have skipped the idea of adopting because it's a lot easier in a lot of ways to have a biological child than to adopt. Like the
Mm-hmm.
process is more predictable. I don't know. I don't want to say there's more in your control. There's always things out of our control, but the time frame is more predictable. So I think that fact that we still wanted to grow our family, and I wasn't really interested in risking another premature baby, kind of encouraged us to take the chance. But also there was just a strong belief that kids need parents. Kids really need parents, and an orphanage system is not the same as being in a home, like a permanent home where parents are going to love and care for them.
Yeah.
So that was kind of our pushing over the decision line.
And like you said, I think that makes so much sense, especially if having, experience, like you said, some challenges just with your biological children, and knowing kind of having that duality of I would like to have more, but that was a really scary place to be in. I can absolutely appreciate where there'd be a lot of hesitations to kind of go back in there, because you said they were both premature. Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, yep. They're 17 months apart in age, and they were both 2 months early. But the second oldest, like everyone has their pregnancy stories, but I went into labor at 24 weeks and then had to go on bed rest until she was
Oh,
born.
wow.
At that point, almost 33 weeks, she was born. So that's not a
Wow.
fun time.
Yeah. And especially if that's kind of your induction into kind of parenthood and in your first experience, I imagine that's incredibly scary to kind of go through that.
Yeah, but I'm so glad. I'm really glad all the pieces came the way they did. We adopted our third child in our family, we adopted,
Mhm.
and then we decided to do it again. So we have, four kids. And boy, it's hard. It is hard to have multiple kids and all the different personalities and the different ways that they interact. It's beautiful and chaotic, and I wouldn't trade it, but boy, like I don't think I expected parenting to be quite so hard when I, was pre-parenting.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that as far as like maybe what you had in your mind's eye, and where did some of that construct for you come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my parents would agree with this, that I was a pretty easy kid to parent, and I was one of four kids. And I
Okay.
think I was just like the rule follower, and I really didn't want to like rock the boat. I just wanted to do what was right,
Okay.
yeah, just get along and follow the rules. So I think I was a pretty easy kid, and I had the false, I think I had the false idea that my kids would be pretty easy kids, and I don't, maybe I should have married someone who was more easy. Maybe I can blame it on my partner.
Right.
But yeah, it definitely was more challenging. And then as we add different dynamics, and our kids who joined our family through adoption, have some trauma in their history and a lot of losses. That's one of the things about adoption is that we always picture the beautiful part of, a family coming together. But before a family comes together through adoption, a family was lost or broken apart through some combination of circumstances and some traumas. And so, every kid that um, joins a family through adoption has experienced loss whether they
Mm.
remember it or not. And that, even though we were prepared with like our adoption preparation stuff to understand early life trauma and losses, I don't think I really had the concept that it would be as hard as it was when we
Okay.
actually got into it.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when our first adoption went through, that's a daughter, one of our daughters, and she was 2 when she joined our family. So 2 is fairly young, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of brain formation and understanding of the world and how safe things are is already formed. A lot of that has been formed in those first 2 years, which I think we kind of take for granted with our biological kids, like how boy, how crucial those time periods are, like how much brain is forming. So,
Yeah.
anyways, we know that she experienced a lot of losses and didn't have the same attachments to us as kids who were born into our family. Totally was feeling prepared for that. But what we found when things were challenging was just either really big explosive behaviors from our daughter or like retaliating kind of behaviors against siblings. Like we have one family legend story called the Lego Massacre, we call it.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so,
Tell me
yes,
more.
I know it sounds really dramatic, but so at the time, our 2 daughters, who are 4 years apart in age, were sharing a bedroom. And we, in order to kind of give the older daughter, who was like a kindergartner at that point, a little space, they had bunk beds. And so the older daughter had the higher bunk bed, and she had some shelves up there where she could keep her special things that were like just for her, that weren't to be
Mm-hmm.
shared. And that was really, really hard for the 2 year old who had just joined our family to have things that were off limits. And, I think there was some struggle to share attention and all of that. Well, one day the 2 year old got up on this ladder, and this like not a normal bunk bed ladder. It was a pretty steep, it was a pretty high loft, and just destroyed Lego Village. It was like all of those cute, like little Lego City things, the ice cream parlors and all of that
Mm-hmm.
that my 5 year old had kind of painstakingly created and was in her safe spot. And so she came in one day and it was just destroyed on her bed, Lego City Massacre. And so things like that just added to the dynamics of some sibling dynamics and some resentments. And it just, what I found is when behaviors came up in our home, like our child was having a big meltdown, which happened a lot, I just felt like the dominoes would fall in the house, as in like child one is having a big meltdown, and then another child gets upset about that, has their own meltdown. Another child has their opinions about how the different children are being parented and whether we're being firm enough or not. And then that child is having issues. I mean, I just felt like um, everything kind of imploded when one
Mm.
child started struggling. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I'm so curious for you, especially in those moments when, like you said, there's lots of meltdowns that are happening. Everyone's struggling with really big things. And what's going on for you as a parent and kind of in your mind, and how are you dealing or what are you feeling in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our hardest season, our hardest kind of parenting year, and this was what tipped the scale to like get some more help, really, in understanding our family. I think the hardest season, we just didn't know how to approach it. My husband, I would talk to him about what was going on in the house. He was working long hours, so he actually wasn't present for most of it. I felt like I was doing a lot of it or most of it alone. And then I would hear from him, well, you need to be firmer. You need to take things away. You need to have a bigger consequence. You need to try it this way. And I just remember feeling like I'm trying all of the things. I'm trying to be firmer. I'm trying to be more connected. I'm trying to be, more intentional with quality one-on-one time. I'm trying to like remove special privileges to let them know that there are consequences. And pretty much all of the things I was trying were not working. Um, so I felt really, really alone during that period of time. And I also
Mm.
remember just not even really talking to like my closest friends about it because I felt embarrassed about the fact that we just could not figure it out. Like I felt like we had there was a time where I felt like I was living with a terrorist, you know. I just never
Yeah.
knew when another meltdown would come out, and sometimes the meltdowns were physically like attacking me or trying to hurt me when things were going wrong. And it
Hmm.
just felt really embarrassing. Like, how am I not able to like figure this out and parent parent my kids? It was hard to be honest with people about how much we were struggling.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of this embarrassment and I've heard that from so many parents. Can you say a little bit more for you, kind of what was your brain trying to convince you of in those moments that if I did reach out to these people, if I did share it, like what was maybe the thought that or thoughts that were coming up that was kind of leading, like you said, to some of that embarrassment for you or feeling like that might be the case that I would feel embarrassed because ABC.
I think part of it was that I had the impression that people thought we were kind of perfect. You know, which maybe was just my impression, but you know, from the outside looking in, it was like, oh, what a great family, you know, like
Hmm.
um I think it looked perfect, not because I was posting all the right things necessarily on social media, but people just, I thought, had that impression. And so I think it felt hard to burst that bubble and let
Yeah.
people know that it wasn't, you know, perfect. And I also, I think, felt embarrassed because, you know, it wasn't my first time being a parent. This was my third child that, you know, things got rougher. Really, actually, after our fourth adoption, when my attention was that, well, our fourth child, second adoption, my attention was that much more divided and my energy
Hmm.
was that much lower, where I kind of really ran out of steam. But I felt like I should be an experienced enough parent to be able to figure it out. Like I felt like I should be able to do this on my own. Like this is parenting has been around forever and I should be able to do it on my own. Which
Yeah.
I don't think anyone ever told me I should feel that way. It just was a false, you know, a false narrative that I had.
Hmm. And I think that's something that I can absolutely relate to that, I've even heard from other folks, like you said, that maybe it's not something that someone's directly kind of coming to you and saying, you have to do it alone. However, somehow it still is very pervasive kind of in our communities, in our society, that does lead so many parents, like you said, to kind of feeling, I have to do this alone and I have to figure this out, which is, gosh, absolutely isolating, especially because these kids don't come with manuals. Like, and each kid, needs their own their own thing, right? One manual doesn't necessarily work for the other child. And
Yeah.
so I can appreciate where, like you said, that maybe it's not someone directly saying that, but somehow it's getting out into the community that that's kind of almost an expectation.
Yeah, and why is that? Because, you know, when you were saying that, Reesa, I was just thinking about the saying that's out there. You know, we hear it all the time. It takes a village to raise a
Mm-hmm.
kid. Everyone's heard that saying, but I don't know that we really take that to heart. You know, we don't
Yeah.
really have a village necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's such a good point because I've heard that saying too. And I think so much of it, though, is, you go out and even though maybe some people aren't necessarily when your kid's having that meltdown in the grocery store, I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Definitely has happened to me.
Definitely has
um,
happened to me.
right. And, there probably are some people in there that are not judging and are like, oh my goodness, been there. I've seen that. I know how hard that is. At the same time, there are very much real things that people are sitting there, giving you the look or muttering under their breath. And so, like you said, instead of offering that, hey, how can I help you right now? Can I like grab your stuff so that you can go wrangle that child that's like running out the door? That there is more often than not kind of just people kind of walking on by. And so I think, like you said, we're not necessarily taking that whole "it takes a village" to heart and demonstrating that, I think, kind of firsthand in our communities. At least that's my personal opinion on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like, you know, if if we really had that village mentality, we would maybe have like our sister in the store as well, or our cousin or our grandma, someone who would be able to step in and like maybe even provide practical help, like in that moment. And so if we don't live in a community with all of our kin around, which I don't, we have to kind of be more intentional about creating our community. And, maybe it's
Mm.
not just biological family, but creating, a few friendships where we are more transparent and real about the struggles and can even ask for some practical assistance when something comes up.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple times in there practical assistance. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you made sure to kind of clarify the type of assistance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think because, like you said, there's lots of looks that we feel like we're getting from people. I remember, I remember that in the church, church and churches that were maybe less welcoming to busy, active little kids in the pews. We ended up looking for a different church because of that, because I just felt like we got stared at and like the mumbles and grumbles as I tried to,
Mm-hmm.
ration out the goldfish crackers to keep my very active son with ADHD quiet in the pew without making too much of a distraction. So that's not practical help. And then when I think about time periods where I just felt like there was too much on my plate and I had a meltdown to manage and also had a child who needed to get to swim practice or something, practical help might be someone that I could call and say, are you able to bring, child one to swim practice while I manage what's going on here? So that I don't have to
Yeah.
bring the meltdown with me in the car and, take it with me to swim practice. I guess that's what I was picturing of that practical, like who could actually step in and lend a hand and take something off of another parent's shoulders.
Yeah. And I think that makes so much sense. Is that because I heard you mention, you don't necessarily have for yourself maybe kin that are kind of nearby. And so you'd mentioned kind of being intentional about building that community, that you could kind of turn to someone and, like you said, ask for some of that practical assistance. Is that something that you have been able to find, or is that still a struggle that you're kind of navigating?
No, I definitely have found it. And in one of well, in that really tough parenting season, I realized I needed to be outside more and I needed to keep my mental health in line by being more active, which is always something I had loved, but was hard to carve out the time for. So I ended up joining a women's running group. And I honestly was not a runner, like, really
Okay.
did not care for running as exercise. I came to love it. I absolutely love running now. But I joined it really just to have something on my schedule that my family recognized as like a mom time away from the house, and I could get outside and connect with some people. And so that group provided a lot of outlets for me. But then as I got a little bit more, a lot more vulnerable about real life in the parenting
Mhm.
world, the goods, there's lots of good things that are happening, but also the real struggles. That's when some very deep friendships formed. And it really came out of me being more transparent and honest about, quite honestly, the harder parts is what bring people together, is sharing the honesty about the hard parts.
Wow. And that's such a different kind of going back to what maybe, you know, our community or society, whatever kind of perpetuates to to have that opposite that in fact when I did get vulnerable, it actually helped deepen my relationships. That's just such a different maybe take on some of these things that do get talked about maybe a little bit more often, of keeping some of that stuff inside, or like you said, we don't talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, I would always say you have to be choosy. I'm sure you would tell people too, like you have to be choosy about who you're going to share or be vulnerable with. It can't be everyone. And I wouldn't necessarily think like social media platforms are the ideal place to be super vulnerable about all of that, the tough stuff. But, picking one or two friends to start with. And um, I think people would be surprised if they lead with vulnerability with their own life, how that relationship deepens.
Wow. Yeah. Was that a difficult place for you to get to allow, like you said, some of that vulnerability? Or was it like once you found kind of your people that kind of came more naturally?
That's a really good question. I think for me, because we were meeting regularly for running, and something about running, like I didn't think at the beginning it would be possible to have a conversation while you run 5 miles. Like how can you be breathing and having a conversation? But as you get better at it, that is totally what happens. And there's something soothing to the brain and like the nervous system about having that repetitive movement running that makes it easier to talk about hard things. I
Mm,
think. And so instead of it being like, hey, let me unload all of these hard things on you in one, hour therapy session or something, it's more of like a sprinkling of little challenges throughout various runs. And over that kind of sprinkling of sharing a snapshot of some of the hard parts of our reality, along with the good parts, that over time is what really created depth in some close friendships. I hope that made sense how
yeah.
I said that.
Absolutely. And, I think that makes tons of sense, especially because, when we add that exercise piece, there are those kind of natural, happy, good chemicals, those endorphins that are flowing through our body, which are important when creating some of that safety and security. You had mentioned earlier, kind of secure attachments and the different attachment styles with your children, and especially those that are maybe coming, like you said, with their own trauma, that does can create some attachment styles, if you will. And so part of creating some of that safety, like you said, is some of those safety signals, which I think that makes a ton of sense, that if you're already kind of in it and your brain's feeling good, and it's people, like you said, that maybe you've you've met with, you're getting safety signals from them, you're getting the safety signals, that your brain is feeling a little bit more relaxed just in the state of, you know, getting the running, getting the exercise, those extra endorphin boosts, where, like you said, maybe it does feel a little bit maybe accessible in those moments, to get there. And then, like you said, that at that point, because you maybe have an outlet, it doesn't feel like I have to just like trauma dump all in one run. But if there's kind of an maybe a consistency there, that it does feel like, yeah, that's, I'm able to kind of talk about, like you said, both of these things and see, yeah, there is a lot of great stuff. There's also a lot of hard stuff, and it's okay to talk about both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right.
I'm curious, can you talk a little bit more, kind of going back to um, some of that, going along that line of the attachment you mentioned, kind of each one of your kids that came to you via adoption, that they kind of have their own stories and their own traumas that they've encountered. And so, what has been your experience now, kind of, if looking out, zooming out, if you will, um, and kind of what helped you be able to show up and support your children and working through some of those things that I think naturally, like you said, if they're coming from this experience that did cause some hurts and some pains, it's only natural that they probably do have some bags that they're coming into the family with. And so, how did you find that you were able to kind of work through that, or things that were helpful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I had kind of, when I got serious about figuring things out and getting some help, I had a multi-pronged approach when I look retrospectively at it. In the moment, I don't think I felt like I had any approach, but I got
Okay.
support from a parent coach who was
Okay.
informed in trauma. And that was a very humbling experience for me to like get that help, I really felt like by asking or seeking out that help, I was basically admitting to being a flawed or ineffectual parent. And that's not
Mm,
how I feel about it now, but it was challenging for me to get that help. And then one of the things that was like a first step, and it felt a little counterintuitive to me because really I wanted to like solve the problems with our kids' behaviors and their challenging interactions and the explosiveness. I really wanted to like focus in on that. And I really had to be mindful of taking care of myself, my own self-care, which I know parents are preach that all the time, self-care is not selfish. And we hear it, but I don't know if it really sinks into our brains. It didn't sink into my brain when self-care was presented to me. But it was very important because I was finding with this repetitive experiences of feeling like I was walking on eggshells in my house, like I wasn't sure which things would, basically, I felt like I was stepping on walking through a minefield. Like some steps would be just fine, and then other steps would release the explosion, and I would have a huge tantrum or meltdown over something that seemed like insignificant. That over
Mm,
time really affected like my nervous system. I would wake up feeling anxious and stressed.
okay.
I started having like stress responses in my body, like heart palpitations and, like eye twitches and things like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, my body is rebelling against me. It's like speaking the story of the stress that I was going through. So I had to be more intentional with taking care of myself. And I did that by just carving out really small chunks of time to be
Okay.
intentional with just pausing. And that's one of the things I talk with parents about is like eventually working up to having 3 small pauses in your day where you're just intentionally taking care of yourself and doing something that's either gives you joy, peace, or energy. So it might just be like setting a timer for 5 minutes, 5 to 15 minutes of these pauses. They're very short and just looking out the window and watching the birds. And that's it.
Mm, hmm.
Or for me, like I have what I call my pre-game plan, which is getting up before my kids and having coffee and doing my devotional time before my kids got up. And that just like helped me regulate my own nervous system and stress so that I could be at my best when we interacted. So that was an important part of me kind of working through that time. And then really understanding trauma better is something that I had to do is, it's not a matter of finding the right consequence to the challenging behavior. It's really about healing relational trauma through healthy relationships. So, um, taking the time to invest in those relationships and then being able to let go of like the need to find the right consequence for everything. Um,
Mm.
that was a challenge.
Can you say a little bit more about that if we could? Because I think that's such an important point that I would love for you to say a little bit more about.
Yeah. I feel like my mind is going in so many directions right now. I like try to pull the right thread back back into the conversation. Um, well, I don't necessarily I grew up with great parents. I have tons of respect for my parents, but I think in general as a culture, we kind of have this feeling, and there are some um parenting theories that are out there, and I won't name any of them, that very much, promote this, where it's like you got to find the immediate right consequence for the action. The consequence has to fit the crime. And a lot of times life brings out its own consequence or its own result to it. And so we don't have to be the consequence wizard and find the right way to punish a negative behavior. The
Mm,
the better approach that I found, but it takes time and intentionality, is to look at what is that behavior communicating. So all behavior is communicating something. And so if I've got a kid who's being picking on siblings or being irrational while I'm cooking dinner, I might have to put on like my detective lens and figure out what else is going on with my kid.
hmm.
What are they communicating? Maybe they're communicating that they're lonely. And so in that case, the consequence of like go to your room until you can behave isn't really going to help meet the root need of feeling lonely. In that case, I might have to find a creative way to bring that child into my circle and engage with that child so they're not feeling so lonely and not looking for ways to get negative attention. Um, so it's not just about finding the right consequence, which might not and probably doesn't hit the root issue that's causing the behavior. It's like
Hmm.
zooming out a little bit more and figuring out what is my child communicating to me through this behavior,
Mm-hmm.
through this meltdown? And how can I meet their needs? And it's not just about, serving our kids in all their ways and like being a doormat, but behaviors communicating some unmet need or some kind of a skill or something that they don't have to be successful in that environment yet. So we either need to support them to be successful or we need to help them meet a need. And that takes a lot more energy, I would say, but it pays off better. But it takes a lot more creativity than just go to your room or you lose your favorite toy or no ice cream for you. And I have to tell you, Reesa, I do those things too sometimes. Like I'm just thinking about this now telling just this last week, my 10-year-old was having a very tough time finding good manners. And I remember saying, we're skipping brownies tonight. I just can't. I cannot do like I'm not cutting the brownies and serving them tonight because I just don't feel it. Like
Yeah.
doing treats. So I'm not saying that I don't pull those out. And for right or wrong, I don't know.
And I appreciate the normalization, right? That hey, we've got our times too. That even you as a coach, that maybe you've gotten fluent in teaching others some of these things. That life happens, and that's the reality of it. And so it's not necessarily perfection, because if we're trying to like go for perfection, we're probably just going to really be let down by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to give, like, I love that, we can laugh about it and give ourselves grace. And, thinking about our village, it has been very helpful to me at times where I've, called or left a message. It's usually like a message for a friend saying, oh my gosh, I had a horrible mom moment and I lost it, at so and so for doing this. And then she'll be like, oh, that's nothing, and it's not like we're going to make light of all of our parenting mistakes, but it's like, no, you're not alone. I also have had moments like that where, just turned into mad mom or, flip my own lid and wasn't at my best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I can absolutely relate to that kind of making light. I don't know how many times my spouse and I, kind of joke, okay, that's going to be something that they're going to talk to a therapist about. Cool,
Yep.
And so that's the way. And maybe that comes because I am a therapist, but I'm constantly on like, yep, okay, there's going to be a session about that one in their future. Cool.
Love it.
Yes. And so I wanted to kind of circle back because I think what you mentioned is just so important in that, maybe that reframe, like you said, of figuring out what is it that need that maybe isn't feeling met in that moment, and that they may not just have the words or even the insight and awareness because they're children. Let's be real about this, that maybe that need is, like you said, I'm feeling lonely in this moment. And so if that's not something that they learn how to put words to, and to be able to figure out an alternative way to get that need met, they're going to do maybe what's just their brain goes, hey, let me try this. And if it is successful, so let's say let's break this Lego set and it gets me kind of parent coming over and talking to me, because even though they're yelling at me, at least they came over. That can, the way that children's brains work is they're constantly figuring out, okay, if I do this, what's the result, and did that meet my need? Well, maybe not in its full capacity, but it did. And so let me try it again. That's how I get that need met. And it can absolutely just, fast forwarding so many of the couples that I work with, where maybe, like you said, what's been trained is that maybe I do need to, I'm feeling angry. And so when that would happen as a child, I would get sent to my room and I need to figure things out on my own. And so again, they figure that out and they learn how to survive, because survival is kind of an instinctual thing that our brain wants to do. And so then that becomes their habit. And that's where you get some of those relationship patterns as adults, where they're like, I keep trying to talk to my partner and they just want to leave and they just keep withdrawing from me. Well, their brain has likely taught them that, hey, when I'm feeling really big emotions, the only way that I can, or I know how to handle them is to go away, is to withdraw.
Yeah,
I
gosh,
so
that's a
you
good point. No, and you had said earlier, which is so true, like our kids don't come with manuals, and if they did, we would need a specific one for each child, which doesn't
yes.
happen. But I often tell parents, like, whether we know it or not, we kind of come into parenting with a blueprint of parenting, and that typically comes from our experience being parented, or with adults in our
Hmm.
life. And so some of our blueprint might be awesome skills, and some of our blueprint might be things that we're like, oh my gosh, I just heard my parents in that, way that I interacted with my kid. And I wish that I could erase that from my blueprint, which we can with time,
Yeah.
if we can be intentional with changing some of those patterns, but it's hard, like that blueprint is
Hmm.
kind of, there is some hard wiring in there from being parented ourselves.
Oh, yes, 100%. And I think that's a great piece to mention because I can't tell you the number of times I've heard from other parents where you do, like you said, maybe go into it going, well, this makes sense because likely that's what we've experienced. And so then we try it. And then sometimes we see that reflected back and we're like, ooh, maybe that wasn't what ought to have happened at the beginning, even for myself. And so now, like you said, kind of figuring out even that rewiring and that reparenting. I don't know how many times I've had that conversation that sometimes when you become a parent yourself, there's a lot of reparenting for yourself that ends up happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up, one of my questions that I love to ask folks, I'm a big Back to the Future fan. So if you had access to a DeLorean and you could go back in time to an age or a period and offer yourself something, not to change the future, but maybe offer yourself some words of kindness or offer yourself a hug, where would you go back and what would you offer yourself?
Ooh, that is a good question. The DeLorean. I can picture it in my head, the DeLorean. Where would I go back to? Um, hmm. The first thing that comes to mind, I'm sure there's lots of times I could go back to, but would probably be that really tough parenting season that I was talking to you about, like before I was getting some support, before I was being honest, or more transparent with friends. I would go back to that version of myself and definitely give her a hug
Hmm.
and maybe whisper in her ear to, point myself in the direction of one of the people I have become really close to, and just kind of nudge that along a little sooner.
Yeah. I love that of even just like you said, a hug and just to whisper that, hey, this is maybe somebody you can trust and that it's okay to reach out to them.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. I have goosebumps. I love it. Okay, so I thank you so much, Dana, for being willing to share this recipe. I've got all my I made 1.5 casserole dishes. I had enough. I think I had a lot of broccoli, uh, but so I thank you so much for being willing to kind of share this recipe, share your story. And so this is the time, my shameless plug, anybody who'd like to connect with you, hear more about your story or any services that you offer, please plug away. Tell us where we can find you.
Well, great. Well, what I love to do is supporting parents who are in those challenging seasons. So if that is you, I would just say you're not alone. Reach out to somebody and get some support. But that is what I love to do. I love helping parents. So livestouchcoaching.com, that's my website, livestouchcoaching.com. And on there, you can find all kinds of things. I do have my first book came out in 2023. It's called Parenting Marathon, the 10-step guide to navigate parenting challenges. And so that book is really all about building our resilience as parents. It's a fast read. It's a journal right in there. You get a chance to write your thoughts right into the book, but it gives us as parents 10 steps to build our own resilience to navigate whatever challenging season we're in. And so I call it parenting marathon because parenting's a lot like running a marathon where it's not a sprint. You have to look at the long game and you
Mm,
have to take care of yourself on the journey. You can't do it by yourself. Um, so that's what the analogy is in there. But it's really will equip you for the current challenge you're in. And then the future ones that will come up. I always tell people you might not ever run an actual marathon, but if you're a parent, you will definitely experience a parenting marathon. So that
Yeah.
book is on my website. It's also on Amazon. My second book is designed for parents who are in the waiting process of an adoption. And that book is
Okay.
called The Great Wait. By the time this podcast airs, the paperback will be available. Right now, the ebook is there, but it's 10 action steps while you wait for your adoption. So that book is designed for those parents like I described myself when we had all of the check boxes checked and the things
Hmm.
done on our to-do list, and yet we still had to wait. What do you do with
Yeah.
that time? What do you do
Hmm.
with it? And how do you find joy in the journey and also prepare yourself and your family for the addition that's coming into your family? So there's that. And then through my business, I work with parents one-on-one doing coaching, but I also have some um, videoed webinars and self-paced courses because really I did that because in my busiest or hardest season, I didn't have time to meet one-on-one with somebody very often. There was so many fires I was putting out. And so
Yeah.
being able to have, someone that you can listen to talk you through a certain topic, meltdown management. How do we manage meltdowns? What do we do in the moment, the heat of the moment? And what do we do in the calm times so that we have fewer meltdowns? That's
Hmm.
one of the self-paced courses. So all of that you can find on my website, livestouchcoaching.com.
Beautiful. And as always, folks, those will be linked in our show notes. So if that resonates with you, please make sure to pop down there, check that out, get connected with all of these wonderful resources, books, and courses and coaching that Dana just shared with us. Dana, thank you again so much for joining me today. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. We will see you next time. If you or anyone that you know is struggling with any of the topics that we discussed in today's episode, make sure to check out our show notes for support and resources. You can get help. Thanks again for joining us on today's episode of The Real Family Eats. If you're a parent ready to share your real life parenting story, make sure to reach out to us in our website found in the show notes. And that goes for today's recipe, social medias, support, and resources. All of that can be found in our show notes. So make sure to check them out. And make sure to follow, like, share, subscribe, and stay up to date on all things The Real Family Eats. I hope you'll join us next time for more food for thought and thoughtful food. Enjoy your eats.